Okay, let's get started. So, predicting the unpredictable, this week we were supposed to talk about current and future global sourcing. And obviously, it is very challenging in the current atmosphere, given that a lot of our normal way of doing things have been disrupted. It's very interesting for me to live through this time because a lot of the things I've been wanting to happen over the past couple of years with disrupting the unsustainable way we've been living has kind of happened over the past couple of weeks. But in no way, shape, or form did I ever wish for people to, um, lose their jobs, lose their lives, lose their loved ones. But it's interesting to try and find some sort of silver lining in thinking how this reset, right, this pause can help us move to a more sustainable economy, one that is inclusive and helps the majority of people. Because I think we can all agree right now, we often say the system is broken, the system is broken. But I would argue that when did it ever truly work for the majority, right? Who did it work for? And how can we now, with this reset, have it work for a larger group of people? So, in the beginning of class, in the beginning of the semester, we talked about um, the five things that we trade. So, we trade products and services, information, capital, we think of money, and people. So, what I did today was I actually looked at each one of these individually to see how they've changed and to try to predict what they will change into. Because right now, we're not at a point where what is today is going to be the same tomorrow or a week or a month from now. We're in this rapid time of change. So products we've definitely seen, um, uh, well, let's put that the products that so many companies were making are no longer valuable in this current situation. Now we have to assume that we're in a temporary situation, but so many companies have shifted over to now what we say is PPE, so protective, personal protective equipment. And whether that is an opportunity for some companies to make money or survive, or it's something that they are switching over because that's the right thing to do. That is the situation we find ourselves in, that a lot of factories, and specifically with hand sanitizer. I was just reading that LVMH, so a lot of brands that are under the LVMH conglomerate have changed over. Beauty companies, especially, I just saw Kylie Jenner, her company switched over to making hand sanitizer. So they're finding ways to remain relevant. Now, looking towards the future, there have been predictions that when we are quote unquote out of this, so when we are able to be seen again, right? Because when it comes to fashion, I can see myself every day. I can put on clothing and feel great, but so much of fashion is about being seen that there might be a resurgence of luxury. And not luxury as we know it in a mass consumption or mass production type of way, because perhaps the Louis Vuitton bag isn't really showing much individuality, but Louis Vuitton is certainly showing you belong to a certain socioeconomic group, right? But luxury in almost a flashy, gaudy, um, using fabrics that are luxurious. And with that, I think will also come sustainability and quality. So, yes, sustainability, I want to know what my clothing is made out of. So perhaps I have a very a fabric that I perceive as being very luxurious, like silk or velvet, right? Those kind of luxuries that maybe have uh, some heritage to them, but also looking at them for quality, right? I've had the opportunity over the past month, and when I say the consumer has the opportunity to really go through their closet and to identify things that they find valuable and that they either have sentimental value or is of a higher quality. And I think that's going to change what they consume moving forward, especially if we're continued to be restricted. And maybe I don't need an outfit for every day, right? We're talking about staggered education, meaning that the workforce and the educational system won't go back to full-time school, but maybe they'll go back to a hybrid of some days you go out and some days you stay in. So maybe those outfits that we do wear going out and to be seen in are going to be outfits that are a bit luxurious, that are higher quality, that are sustainable in the sense that they're going to last us a long time. Even some of us, I think, have learned to mend things while we're in this situation, whether it's looking for something to do or reflecting on what you already have and how you can make it better, or maybe it's out of a financial need. A lot of people are out of jobs, so perhaps they're finding themselves mending clothing because they can't afford to buy new things. So one interesting website that I found was Glimpse, and I'm going to click on it and open it up. And this is a website that tracks people who are viewing certain things on the internet. So they have all these different categories. And what I like about it is it doesn't even just tell you the percentage, how much this search has gone up, but also why. So I'm sure we can all guess why DIY haircuts are being searched more. So it says, without being able to go outside, consumers are increasingly self-reliant for things like haircuts. So I encourage you guys to look at this presentation, get the link, and view some of these things on your own time, because it's quite funny how they change, but also quite sad, the reality in the United States of our ever-present love of ammunition and guns. But there were some interesting things in here that I have come back to time and time again. Look at that unemployment application, a 5,600% increase. It's very interesting. Okay, so going back to the presentation. So that's what we can think about luxury or products right now, that right now we're meeting a need. We're only servicing things that are creating things that are needed, but there might be the pendulum swinging from that, going to the other part where maybe we're a bit self-indulgent, but not in the ways that we used to be, but in a way of rewarding ourselves and hopefully purchasing things that will be used for a longer time. Okay, so then let's look at services. So what is needed? I love, I found this chart. So we all know Maslow's hierarchy of need, and especially now Wi-Fi has become the most important. And with so many things changing in such a short time, it really highlighted a lot of problems within our systems, whether it's healthcare or technology. A crisis like this, and past crisis of financial ones, often highlight where we're lacking, and this has hit us in all the levels. So obviously we have problems with access to healthcare. It was very interesting. I'm not sure if it was this class or another class, and I asked what was a prediction of what is to come. What is the silver lining? What trends might happen? And I think every student said healthcare, which is something that this country has been talking about and working on for a long time, to give access to all people. And hopefully this will tip the scale in making that actually happen. So services that are needed are certainly technology. We see companies such as Zoom, shout out to Zoom right now, right? That are saving us in so many ways. But at the same time, we also see how inadequate our government is, how our government, they're not able to pass laws without meeting in person. There's actually laws in place that don't allow people to vote for these things remotely. So I think as the coming months take us into the actual election that's about to happen, more outcry and more conversation is going to be had about allowing more technology into our government and how we govern, whether it's on a local level or on a national, federal level. Another interesting thing that has happened specifically to the supply chain throughout this crisis is, and we've talked about this a little bit, farmers unable to provide market for their products that they were selling in bulk once upon a time. I was reading something about bars, how the majority of bars make their money from kegs. And right now is not a time when anybody is trying to order a keg. And those companies that provide those kegs are having a hard time going to personal sizes. So to individual, 6-packs or whatever it may be. So certainly a supply chain issue that I predict that when we go back to being able to be to go into restaurants and stores again, even though it's going to be on a very limited level, right? We're going to be given access. We're going to have to wait 2 weeks to a month to see if this virus is reactive to that. And if it is, then we're going to have to pull back and restrict again. So hopefully we can slowly open things back up, but there might be an opening and then a restricting, further opening and further restricting. So bulk is something certainly interesting that a lot of people are still having trouble, like I said, finding outlets, finding retail distribution for their produce, milk, because they were used to packaging in bulk and selling to restaurants or selling to schools. And now that those are closed, they have to find a way to package it in smaller amounts, because we're all in our houses with, 1 to 5 people. So some of the winners are a company like HelloFresh. HelloFresh has been designed to have individual packaging where they're sending you a meal that you can make 1 to 2 servings. This is something that did not exist a couple of years ago. So it is certainly a silver lining for them to be able to, quote unquote, win in this moment. We talked a little bit about education. So when it comes to services, there is certainly an increased demand, like I said, on Zoom, but there are a lot of other educational platforms that are being used. Google has a lot of tools. I think Google Meet and Google Classroom. So those companies that are able to provide teachers with services that they can use easily, and it doesn't impede upon the learning process. And what I mean by that is technology has to be user-friendly. Otherwise, you spend all your time learning the technology and not learning the actual information that you're trying to streamline the technology on. And I hope that makes sense, right? It's like my first Zoom class. If I spent the whole time getting people to log on, we're not actually learning the material that we need to learn. So Zoom is very user-friendly. You click a link, you get on, you get used to it after hopefully a short time. And then from there, we can learn this material and not have the technology impede on the actual learning. So we've also noticed from this crisis, specifically in New York City, how we're going to have to change our housing laws to a certain extent, but more so access to housing, because the month is almost up and there's a large amount of people who are unemployed who are not able to pay their rent. So they're talking about rent freezes. They have kind of thrown around rent freezes in the sense you won't have to pay rent for 3 months, but then perhaps you'll have to repay over a certain amount of time. But lawmakers are saying that's not really good enough, because if you don't have the money now, who's going to say you have the money in 3 months? So that's something we need to keep learning and researching how they're going to deal with a housing crisis. But I'm curious, Maybe right now is a good time to have a poll. How many of you were anticipating staying in New York and living in New York, and now because of this crisis are either finding yourself moving back home, or perhaps it's going to be too expensive still to live in New York. So if that resonates with anyone and you want to say a yes or a no in our participant window, we can try that out. Yeah, I'm certainly concerned. Each month, I think I've definitely seen a surplus of U-Haul vans taking people out of the city as they find refuge in cheaper places, perhaps. And one of the last services that we're definitely going to have to provide, so this is either an opportunity that is unyet met, or things like Headspace, so mental health applications are becoming more accepted and frequently used. I think the city is definitely going to have to put some services in place for us to find outlets to heal our mental health, because as social creatures, being inside has definitely affected us in ways we haven't quite realized yet. So what's interesting is when we talk about the 5 things that we trade, right? Products, services, information, capital, and people. Services are ones that have certainly been disrupted, but have been maybe the easiest out of the 5 to innovate on a quick level, right? Because we have all this technology. So imagine what this pandemic would look like if it was 2007, 2008, and we didn't have smartphones and we didn't have high-speed internet. We would definitely be less connected than we are now and living in a very different reality. Okay, so moving on from services. So now to information. How has information been disrupted, and where is it going to go? So there's definitely a questioning of what is true. What is true in this world where there's such an increase of information? We have to still remember that this is relatively new, that we have a 24-hour news cycle, that we have not just 24-hour news access, but we can choose the truth that we want to hear, right? I think last week we had the School of Life video in praise of bias. So what is the cost of increase in information? We kind of have this niche information where I can have a certain perspective or a way of thinking, and I can find a community that backs up my way of thinking, even if it's not based on truth or it's not based on a shared cultural values. And you can really set yourself up now where everyone's an expert, right? I can take a video camera, I can put myself in a professional setting. I could even put myself with a backdrop with an American flag and some sort of crest on it, and I could look like a public official. There's so much you can do now, and we're not even talking about augmented reality and virtual reality, where we can put ourselves in positions. So is there going to be a backlash to this where people want to consume less news? Perhaps. Is this going to be something that we can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? That it is what it is, and maybe there's going to someday be certifications, like this has been certified by a government body saying that this is actual truth. One thing I do see that is a silver lining to all this is how much we're looking at science to save us. And for the most part, science has been disputed for, a decade or two. So I think we're still living in this, niche world where there's a a small but vocal people that don't believe in science, but I think this is the time where science will win out. And we can see Dr. Fauci being one of the leaders that we are all looking towards, and that's gonna, that does something to our perception or how we're going to make decisions in the future. The next thing I wanted to highlight was entertainment. Entertainment. I'm curious. This is a good poll. Let me clear it for a second first. How many of you believe that movie theaters will come back, or do you think Netflix is it? Do we think movie theaters will come back? Yes or no? Yes, they will. No, they won't. I got one for yes, one for no. Oh, I got a couple of no's. Yeah, how comfortable will we feel going back into movie theaters? So in Atlanta or in Georgia, all of Georgia, they're opening up movie theaters this week. How many of you would go if you were in Georgia? This past week, they opened up gyms and they opened up salons. I'm very concerned for them because gyms and salons seem like a place that would breed germs. But perhaps movie theaters will become more of a luxurious affair. Maybe they'll split them up into sections where you have your own 6-foot space and maybe you have to pay a premium and maybe it's something nostalgic of the past. Another thing somebody was considering, drive-through movie theaters. Does anybody remember seeing it in an old movie? I doubt any of you. I've never been to a drive-through movie theater. Perhaps that's something that will come up. And so information. So one silver lining I wanted to bring up, violent crime is down significantly. Violent crime is down. So what does that mean for long-term implications? That means that a large population that would be headed into the jail system may not be there. So perhaps there's some silver lining there, but there's definitely fear, you know, as far as human contact. One thing that we have seen that has gone up that has been quite sad is domestic abuse. Another thing that's very interesting is that New York State has allowed people to now get married online, but you can't get divorced. So right now you can go online, you can get married, you can get a marriage certificate. But if you want to get divorced, you have to wait till this crisis is over. How interesting. Another thing to bring up, surveillance. I was listening to the radio today. If anybody is looking for a job, they are looking to train people on being contact tracers, meaning that, all right, well, let me take it back a minute. So countries like South Africa, countries like East Africa and countries in West Africa, they have done better at controlling this outbreak because they've had diseases that are communicable through contact, meaning that South Africa has a contact tracing task force because they have tuberculosis still active in that country. So if I got tuberculosis and I went to the doctor, there would be a group who would contact me asking me who I've been in contact with, and they would go to those other people and put them under quarantine. So that's something that happened before this pandemic. So the same thing with Ebola. So countries and a lot of Southeast Asian or Asian countries, because they had other forms of SARS, they had bird flu, they had swine flu. So they had these policies and procedures in place to find people some sort of surveillance to make sure that things were not spreading. The United States, we do not have that in any way, shape, or form. So like I said today, they had a news report come out where they're putting together this task force and they're looking to train people. And it's a lot of phone calls and it's a lot of follow-ups and it's a lot of filling out charts to in the near future, when cases go down enough, if there are new cases that come up of COVID-19, they can track them, they can put them under quarantine and eradicate the disease that way. So another interesting link that I put in here that hopefully you'll get a chance to look at later on And I know there's some chatting in the chat box, but I'll get to that probably at the end now. So this was an interesting media consumption. So it goes over the different generations and how they're consuming media and what percentage. So I hear y'all are on that TikTok all the time. I don't know anything about that TikTok. It says it right here, right? 51% online videos. So we have all different forms of media consumption, and it goes through each generation. So millennials are heavier on online TV streaming, music streaming, still heavy on the online videos. I would say out of all the generations, they're the most diverse of all the media that they're consuming, evenly diverse, I'd say. So Gen X kind of looks like origami, right? And baby boomers mainly consuming their media from broadcast TV. Not a big surprise, but an interesting depiction of this nonetheless, right? Okay, so continuing on. Okay, so capital. So what is money worth? What is money worth? And this is the one that I think I have the hardest time analyzing and predicting, because money and capital is ingrained in us as humans. So to even entertain the conversation of getting rid of our monetary system and moving over to a digital currency seems crazy. However, the past stimulus bill, they actually had a few lines in there talking about a digital currency, and at the end they ended up taking it out and it not making it into any laws. So it's very interesting to think about. I'm not saying that they're going to adopt Bitcoin by any, at any point, but to reimagine a global currency system might be something we can talk about now. Especially, this isn't a recession that is hitting one country or a few countries, but it's hitting everyone globally. So not to work backwards, but I think we mentioned last week also the negative oil prices. So what's the better bet for you to invest your money? Is it in renewable resources like solar or hydroelectric dams or wind? Or is it in the negative oil prices? So just to share a little bit more light on how oil prices can be negative is in the market we have supply and demand, right? So they have too much supply. Saudi Arabia and Russia and the United States have not reduced their oil production as much as they should have. People aren't consuming oil because we're not driving anywhere. We get a lot of cheap fuel from fracking in this country, and a lot of people who frack, they did not want to shut down their oil rigs, because once you shut it down, it's very hard to get the capital, the money to restart it. So they were still producing oil, and it ended up in the stock market going to negative $37 a barrel. But regardless of what the price was last week, it's just unstable, and we see prices from oil fluctuating, and you don't want to invest your money in something that's going to go up and down and be so volatile. Another interesting point to mention, anybody raise a hand, get a stimulus check? I didn't get one yet. So the government is giving out money, a one-time payment of $1,200 to certain people who have paid taxes, who make below a certain amount each year. And it's interesting because a lot of people talk about a basic universal income. A basic universal income meaning that we're going to pay people just to live, just to exist. It's some type of welfare. We already do that to a certain extent. It's called unemployment, but we limit it to a certain amount. So these stimulus checks are going to have to keep coming in. And who knows if they're going to be done on a consistent, dare I say, permanent basis. But I think what's going to happen is people are going to have to demand it, right? We can't pay our bills for our housing. We don't have a job anymore, not because I wasn't a good worker, not because the company that I worked for wasn't good at business, but because the government told us we had to shut down. So there's an interesting thing happening where I lost my job. I now have to collect unemployment. Say I work for Apple. Apple furloughed me or they fired me. Now, Apple is also getting money from the government, right? A lot of corporations are getting bailout money. And where is that bailout money going? It's not going to the worker, right? Because they fired them. So it's going towards paying the rent for, Apple isn't the best example, but it's going for rent for all their Apple stores. But the problem is that Apple doesn't really pay its fair share of taxes, right? It hides a lot of money in other countries that have looser tax laws. So as we're sitting at home, and we've talked before in the past about how the average American is often getting a new type of entertainment on Netflix, right? All these documentaries, and there's a lot of documentaries out right now talking about corporate bailouts, talking about tax structures and how all this money is sent over to a lot of islands, a lot of Caribbean islands that hold on to the money and you don't have to pay taxes for. So I certainly think that there's going to be a backlash against that in terms of the cycle of all of us getting money from the government, but these big corporations just paying out their stakeholders and not being very patriotic, right? They have all this money stashed away and they're not letting it circulate through the economy to go to the people who need it the most. And I'm just going to click on this for a minute. Oops. I would love for you guys to take a look at this link at your own time. So the coronavirus crisis has changed money forever. Maybe not. Okay. So an interesting article going through, this was where I found the quote for the a digital currency. Let's see if I can find it. A digital currency being put, um, being proposed with the stimulus plan. But another interesting article for any of you who are interested in how our relationship with money and how the government's relationship with money will change. But I just noticed the time, so let me continue. One or two more slides. I know all of you are at the edge of your seat, so excited, hanging on every word. Okay, people. So what are people worth? Oh, this is a really tough, heartbreaking question. One in 6 people who are working right now are immigrants. We've continued to be anti-immigrant. Last week, our president decided that they were not going to take any green card applications. This is a big mistake when so much of what our government, our world still functioning is reliant on immigrants right now. Immigrants are not able to benefit from much of the stimulus packages. And even if they are, even if they have been paying taxes, there's a lot of fear right now because there's even stipulations where if you've collected any federal aid, you're not able to apply to become a citizen. So with the laws constantly changing, if I were an immigrant trying to become a legal citizen here, I certainly probably wouldn't be collecting any money if that was going to mess up my chances for being able to stay here permanently, especially if I had children. So immigrants are something that we have been focusing on over, the past 3 years, we'll say 3, 4 years, advocating for their rights. And it breaks my heart to just see how many of them are being negatively affected by this crisis. And I won't, go too much into that. So then thinking about incarcerated people, we see a lot of suffering with incarcerated people. They did let a lot of people out of the prisons while this crisis was taking form. But still many have been infected and many have been have passed away because of this. But we had been making a lot of changes in how we incarcerate people over the past couple of years. And now maybe, like I said, since violent crime is down, since there's also not as many police officers, right? Police officers have been hit hard by this virus. So I think it's certainly a combination of lack of police to enforce the laws, but also lack of people out and about committing crimes. But perhaps we'll see a dip in incarceration over a long term because of this pause. Tourism, especially in New York City, we rely on tourism. It's going to be a very interesting summer for us, not having our normal influx of European tourists or tourists from around the world. It will be interesting to see if a place like the MoMA, are they going to have by appointment only, right? And you can only enter the MoMA, say, your appointment is from 1 to 2, and they've only let 50 people in, 100 people in, and everybody has to keep distance. Maybe that's something that we can do with not as many tourists there, and it will be interesting to see what that does to our culture as New Yorkers. Education and work. So the parts that I wanted to talk about with the education and work that are interesting is that we may not go back to a normal going to school 5 days a week, going to work 5 days a week. A lot of people are talking about staggering, whether you go to work Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or you go in the morning or in the afternoon. What's very interesting about that is the environmental impact. Right now we see the lack of cars in the road, lack of people moving around, that affecting the environment for the good. And, if we look back to the history of work, we've really been working on the same mindset since the Industrial Revolution. So before the Industrial Revolution or during it, we had people working 7 days a week. We had children working. Health insurance wasn't pitted on there wasn't any health insurance, but then they created the 40-hour work week. And when you work 40 hours, then you get health insurance and unemployment if you lose your job. So a lot of those things are going to have to be reworked if we're not required to physically be at our job. And this is probably for the good because, we really didn't need people. This has shown us that we don't have to be at work as much as we thought we did. Or even looking at the open plan system, right? A lot of work environments right now are all cubicles and an open floor plan. Perhaps we're going to have to go into little glass cages, right? Each have an office of some sort. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with the co-working spaces, with office space in general. Perhaps office space is not going to be as the word I'm looking for. Maybe office space in Midtown in Manhattan will be used for other things because it's not needed to house people for work anymore. So a lot of interesting things are happening. So I wanted to pose some questions to you and kind of open it up for some conversation. I see the time ticking by, so we'll see what we can do with your presentations as well. But I wanted to give you the time to at least think and discuss. So where are the opportunities for students? What can I do to take advantage of these opportunities? And how can I continue to keep learning? So, what I guess I'll give some personal information. So when the recession happened, I was just finishing up ITM actually. I was a student, and one of the best things that you can do during a recession is keep going to school. So for those of you who have a semester or two ahead, that's probably the best thing right now, is to stay in school and kind of weather the storm. A lot of people during this time end up going back to school, going back to graduate school. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, because I think you need time in between degrees to process the information that you've learned, to practice it in real life work experiences. Um, but I think where the opportunity lies is that so many people your age have been taught to be entrepreneurs, to have an entrepreneurial streak in them, because I think you've been raised on the idea that we can't rely on corporations to provide jobs for us for our entire lives, that maybe our parents or our grandparents took advantage of. Or perhaps um, were encouraged from a young age to be innovative, you were told you weren't going to have just one career, but you were going to have a number of careers and move around. So, I think so much power is in your hands, but the hard part is not to get distracted, right? Because so easily, I'm sure you guys can all relate to this, that you have 3 things you need to do in the day, and you get distracted and do all these other things, and then you're rushing to do those 3 things by the end of the day, and it's hard and it's exhausting, and you're moaning and you're complaining, when if you woke up and you got those 3 things done, you could have spent the rest of your day how you wanted to. So I think it's changing that mindset to working from home, right? Like, the power's in your hands to figure out when you're going to get things done, what breaks you're going to have, and how you're going to take advantage of them. I think the power is also in your hands to identify problems and bring them to the attention of companies that you want to work for. And that's why I like this term project so much, was because um, it gave you the experience, the opportunity to analyze a company and to find out what's wrong and then provide solutions to them. And that is the future of work. I think I told you guys last week, the proposal that you guys did is actually a proposal I use all the time. So there was a company that um, was needing, they had identified they were trying to get into this market, and I put together that same proposal and sent it to them and said, hey, this is what I can do for you. Here are examples. I didn't even give them examples of my past work, but here's what I can provide. This is how long it's going to take. Here's a timeline. This is how much I'm going to charge you. And that's how you're going to get work in the future. You're going to reach out to maybe companies that are a little bit older, that aren't technologically advanced, that are so impressed by a beautiful Canva pitch deck. And you send things like that to them. And maybe at first you're going to have to charge a cheaper price, because we have things like Fiverr, we have all of these websites now that allow us to find work, um, freelance work. But once you start to build that up, once you start to find the things that you're good at and where uh, things are needed, you can fill the white space, right? You can find the white space in the market, and you can fill them and do them from the comfort of your own home, because you know how to have a professional Zoom call, right? You know how to um, uh, Google things and figure things out and say, sure, I can do that. I can have that to you in a week. And you can find the resources that are going to give you those answers. So that's why I put it in there. How can I continue to keep learning? After this semester is over, give yourself a break. Don't look at a book for a month if you have the luxury not to do that. But after that, continue to learn something new. And that's the beauty of FIT. People keep coming back to FIT to keep learning. And if online, which has been the trend, but continues to be the trend, it may even get cheaper as people another thing that we didn't talk about, but um, as government maybe offers free education of some sort, continue learning, continue improving those skills, because as the government transforms into more technology, as healthcare transforms into technology, they're going to need people like you who can manage their time between providing that technology and doing it quickly and efficiently. So the last thing I kind of wanted to do was ask you about your key takeaways. Your key takeaways. You know, when we talk about international trade or not international trade, trend analysis, we talk about scanning the culture. So that's what I kind of did today. I laid out for you guys all these different areas that are transforming and changing. So I'm really curious if there are any things that you can piece together. And I'll give you one that I've kind of pieced together. So the United States has, you know, since World War II, been the dominant country. But everyone's looking at us right now, and the way we're kind of handling this pandemic is not great, right? We don't have the infrastructure, the technology. We don't have ability to provide our own people with personal protective equipment. And the number one thing that we export, and I've mentioned this before, is our culture. So how are we to influence other countries, to lecture them on how they should live or the human rights they should have when we're not providing that to our own citizens? And I think that was apparent before, but it's very apparent now. So I'm hoping that as we get knocked off our pedestal, maybe this will be a little bit of humble pie, and we can reassess our values and what we want to export to the world. And hopefully this can be a turning point where we want to export more democracy and less influence, where we can export more information and knowledge sharing and less capitalism and consumerism. Because our view of consumerism is certainly changing and shifting right now. And that was the main message that we have been sending out to not just our citizens, but to the world. Shop and everything will be okay. And now shopping is not going to save us. So the tides are turning, and there's definitely a disruption in just that line of thinking.